This episode is brought to you by Marvel Studios Echo. All episodes streaming January 9th, only on Hulu and Disney+. Rated TV MALV. Viewer discretion advised. Maya Lopez has betrayed her mentor, the notorious Kingpin. Now on the run, she returns to her hometown to prepare for the biggest fight of her life. Don't miss Marvel Studios' hardest-hitting series yet. An epic 5-episode event. Marvel Studios Echo. All episodes streaming January 9th, only on Hulu and Disney+.
Hello, and welcome to a special Christmas episode of Scare You to Sleep. I'm your host, Shelby Scott. Now, gather round while I tell you a little about the tradition of telling ghost stories at Christmas. Ghost stories at Christmas has been a tradition in the UK and the rest of Europe since all the way back in the pagan days, when they were celebrating the winter solstice. For a long time, Christmas would have been pretty recognizable. Lots of food and games and songs. Even better, there were no inflatable minions wearing Santa hats in anyone's yards. Fast forward to the 17th century when this guy named Oliver Cromwell came along and was named the Lord and Protector of England. Now, Cromwell was a Puritan and was on a mission to cleanse the nation of its most decadent excesses, writes Clemency Burton Hill for The Guardian. On the top of the list was Christmas and all its festive trappings. So, on December 19th, 1643, an ordinance was passed encouraging subjects to treat the midwinter period with the more solemn humiliation because it may call to remembrance our sins and the sins of our forefathers, who have turned this feast, pretending the memory of Christ, into an extreme forgetfulness of him by giving liberty to carnal and sensual delights. Thus, until 1660, Christmas was illegal. No songs, no games, no ghost stories, no fun. The ban on Christmas was extremely unpopular with those who were not Puritans, and England even had a bout of pro-Christmas riots until the ban was lifted. Now, let's hit fast forward again. We get to the mid-19th century, and Christmas is becoming sort of a passing fad. Think of all the hubbub these days around Christmas. Imagine if next year we collectively just thought, meh, Christmas is old and dusty, let's just, not do it anymore. Well, we can thank greed for a resurgence in Christmas cheer. Victorian business owners were looking for a new way to commercialize the holiday and started this new thing called Christmas cards. That and the fact that some writer named Charles Dickens published his novel A Christmas Carol, and Christmas was back in fashion. A Christmas Carol also reignited the love of telling ghost stories at Christmas. In recent years, however, the tradition seems to be waning again. In America, it's never really been a part of our Christmas celebrations. In fact, in the famous Christmas song, It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year, Andy Williams specifically mentions telling scary ghost stories, and as a kid, I was very intrigued yet confused by the notion of even mentioning scary ghost stories during Christmas. So, dear listeners, this is my little attempt at injecting some spirits back into the Christmas spirit. I know I glazed over a lot. The history of Christmas is really fascinating, and I hope my UK listeners will let me know if I got anything wrong. I'm genuinely interested in the subject of Christmas ghost stories. There were so many great traditional stories to choose from, it was hard to whittle it down to 2. But I feel like these are both fun and pretty family-friendly if the kids want to listen. This first one actually gave me chills. I was home alone recording, and I had some weird audio issues while I was recording the scariest part, and it genuinely unnerved me for a bit. So first up is A Strange Christmas Game by J.H. Riddell and was written in 1863. Now, one thing I noticed was a little lost in reading this aloud. There is mention of the main character's sister having a quote-unquote little girl in mind for her brother to marry. Now, the little girl is in quotes and is an outdated phrase for a young woman. Don't worry, I read you creepy stuff, but nothing that would actually condone child brides. Like I always say, we may love horror, but we aren't monsters. When, through the death of a distant relative, I, John Lester, succeeded to the Martingale estate, there could not have been found in the length and breadth of England a happier pair than myself and my only sister Claire. We were not such utter hypocrites as to affect sorrow for the loss of our kinsman, Paul Lester, a man whom we had never seen, of whom we had heard but little, and that little unfavorable, at whose hands we had never received a single benefit, who was, in short, as great a stranger to us as the then Prime Minister, the Emperor of Russia, or any other human being utterly removed from our extremely humble sphere of life. His loss was very certainly our gain. His death represented to us not a dreary parting from one long loved and highly honored, but the accession of lands, houses, consideration, wealth to myself, John Lester, artist and second-floor lodger at 32 Great Smith Street, Bloomsbury. Not that Martingale was much of an estate as country properties go. The Lesters, who had succeeded to that domain from time to time during the course of a few hundred years, could by no stretch of courtesy have been called prudent men. In regard of their posterity, they were, indeed, scarcely honest, for they parted with manors and farms, with common rights and advowsons, in a manner at once so baronial and so unbusinesslike, that Martingale at length, in the hands of Jeremy Lester, the last resident owner, melted to a mere little dot in the map of Bedfordshire. Concerning this Jeremy Lester, there was a mystery. No man could say what had become of him. He was in the oak parlor at Martingale one Christmas Eve, and before the next morning he had disappeared, to reappear in the flesh no more. Overnight, one Mr. Worley, a great friend and boon companion of Jeremy's, had sat playing cards with him until after 12 o'clock chimes, and he took leave of his host and rode home under the moonlight. After that, no person, as far as could be ascertained, ever saw Jeremy Lester alive. His ways of life had not been either the most regular or the most respectable, and it was not until a new year had come in without any tidings of his whereabouts reaching the house that his servants had become seriously alarmed concerning his absence. Then enquiries were set on foot concerning him, enquiries which grew more urgent as weeks and months passed by, without the slightest clue being obtained as to his whereabouts. Rewards were offered, advertisements inserted, but still Jeremy made no sign. And so, in course of time, the heir at law, Paul Lester, took possession of the house, and went down to spend the summer months at Martingale with his rich wife and her 4 children by a first husband. Paul Lester was a barrister, an overworked barrister, who everyone supposed would be glad enough to leave the bar and settle in at Martingale, where his wife's money and the fortune he had accumulated could not have failed to give him a good standing even among the neighboring country families. And perhaps it was with such intention that he went down into Bedfordshire. If this were so, however, he speedily changed his mind, for with the January snows, he returned to London, let off the land surrounding the house, shut up in the hall, put in a caretaker, and never troubled himself further about his ancestral seat. Time went on, and people began to say the house was haunted, that Paul Lester had seen something, and so forth, all which stories were duly repeated for our benefit when, 41 years after the disappearance of Jeremy Lester, Claire and I went down to inspect our inheritance. I say our because Claire had stuck bravely to me in poverty, grinding poverty, and prosperity was not going to part us now. What was mine was hers, and that she knew, God bless her, without my needing to tell her so. The transition from rigid economy to comparative wealth was, in our case, the more delightful also because we had not in the least degree anticipated it. We never expected Paul Lester's shoes to come to us, and accordingly it was not upon our consciences that we had ever in our dreariest moods wished him dead. Had he made a will, no doubt, we never should have gone to Martingale, and I, consequently, never written this story. But, luckily for us, he died intestate, and the Bedfordshire property came to me. As for the fortune, he had spent it in traveling and in giving great entertainments at his grand house in Portman Square. Concerning his effects, Mrs. Lester and I came to a very amicable arrangement, and she did me the honor of inviting me to call upon her occasionally, and, as I heard, spoke of me as a very worthy and presentable young man for my station, which, of course, coming from so good an authority, was gratifying. Moreover, she asked me if I intended residing at Martingale, and on my replying in the affirmative, hoped I should like it. It struck me at the time that there was a certain significance in her tone, and when I went down to Martingale and heard the absurd stories which were afloat concerning the house being haunted, I felt confident that if Mrs. Lester had hoped much, she had feared more. People said Mr. Jeremy walked at Martingale. He had been seen, it was averred, by poachers, by gameskeepers, by children who had come to use the park as a near cut to school, by lovers who kept their tryst under the elms and beeches. As for the caretaker and his wife, the third in residence since Jeremy Lester's disappearance, the man gravely shook his head when questioned, while the woman stated that wild horses, or even wealth untold, should not draw her into the red bedroom, nor into the oak parlor after dark. I have heard my mother tell, sir, it was her as followed old Mrs. Reynolds, the first caretaker, how there were things went on in these self-same rooms as might make any Christian's hair stand on end. Such stamping and swearing and knocking about on furniture, then tramp, 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 up the great staircase and along the corridor and so into the red bedroom, and then bang and tramp, tramp again. They do say, sir, Mr. Paul Lester met him once, and from that time the oak parlor has never been opened. I never was inside it myself. Upon hearing which fact, the first thing I did was to proceed to the oak parlor, open the shutters, and let the August sun stream in upon the haunted chamber. It was an old-fashioned, plainly furnished apartment, with a large table in the center, a smaller in a recess by the fireplace, chairs ranged against the walls, and a dusty, moth-eaten carpet upon the floor. There were dogs on the hearth, broken and rusty. There was a brass fender, tarnished and battered, a picture of some sea fight over the mantelpiece, while another work of art about equal in merit hung between the windows. Altogether an utterly prosaic and yet not uncheerful apartment, from out of which the ghosts flitted as soon as daylight was let into it, and which I proposed, as soon as I felt my feet, to redecorate, refurnish, and convert into a pleasant morning room. I was still under 30, but I had learned prudence in that very good school, necessity, and it was not my intention to spend much money until I had ascertained for certain what were the actual revenues derivable from the land still belonging to the Martingale estates, and the charges upon them. In fact, I wanted to know what I was worth before committing myself to any great extravagances, and the place had for so long been neglected that I experienced some difficulty in arriving at the state of my real income. But in the meanwhile, Claire and I found great enjoyment in exploring every nook and corner of our domain, in turning over the contents of old chests and cupboards, in examining the faces of our ancestors looking down on us from the walls, in walking through the neglected gardens full of weeds overgrown with shrubs and birdweed, where the boxwood was 18 feet high and the shoots of the rose trees yards long. I have put the place in order since then. There is no grass on the paths. There are no trailing brambles all over the ground. The hedges have been cut and trimmed, and the trees pruned and the boxwood clipped. But I often say nowadays that in spite of all my improvements, or rather, in consequence of them, Martingale does not look one half so pretty as it did in its pristine state of uncivilized picturesqueness. Although I determined not to commence repairing and decorating the house till better informed concerning the rental of Martingale, still the state of my finances was so far satisfactory that Claire and I decided on going abroad to take our long talked-of holiday before the fine weather was past. We could not tell what a year might bring forth, as Claire sagely remarked. It was wise to take our pleasure while we could, and accordingly, before the end of August arrived, we were wandering about the continent, loitering at Rouen, visiting the galleries at Paris, and talking of extending our 1 month of enjoyment into 3. What decided me on this course was the circumstance of our becoming acquainted with an English family who intended wintering in Rome. We met accidentally, but discovering that we were near neighbors in England, in fact that Mr. Cronson's property lay close beside Martingale, the slight acquaintance soon ripened into intimacy, and ere long we were traveling in company. From the first, Claire did not much like this agreement. There was a little girl in England that she wanted me to marry, and Mr. Cronson had a daughter who certainly was both handsome and attractive. The little girl had not despised John Lester, artist, while Miss Cronson indisputably set her cap at John Lester of Martingale, and would have turned away her pretty face from a poor man's admiring glance. All this I can see plainly enough now, but I was blind then, and should have proposed for Mabel, that was her name, before the winter was over, had news not suddenly arrived of the illness of Mrs. Cronson Sr. In a moment the program was changed. Our pleasant days of foreign travel were at an end. The Cronsons packed up and departed, while Claire and I returned more slowly to England, a little out of humor, it must be confessed, with each other. It was the middle of November when we arrived at Martingale, and we found the place anything but romantic or pleasant. The walks were wet and sodden, the trees were leafless. There were no flowers save a few late pink roses blooming in the garden. It had been a wet season, and the place looked miserable. Claire would not ask Alice down to keep her company in the winter months as she had intended. And for myself, the Cronsons were still absent in Norfolk, where they meant to spend Christmas with old Mrs. Cronson, now recovered. Altogether, Martingale seemed dreary enough, and the ghost stories we had laughed at while sunshine flooded the rooms became less unreal when we had nothing but blazing fires and wax candles to dispel the gloom. They became more real also when servant after servant left us to seek situations elsewhere, when noises grew frequent in the house, when we ourselves, Claire and I, with our own ears heard the tramp, tramp, the banging and the clattering which had been described to us. My dear reader, you are doubtless free from superstitious fancies. You pooh-pooh the existence of ghosts and only wish you could find a haunted house in which to spend a night, which is all very brave and praiseworthy, but wait till you are left in a dreary, desolate, old country mansion, filled with the most unaccountable sounds, without a servant, with no one save an old caretaker and his wife, who, living at the extremest end of the building, heard nothing of the tramp, tramp, bang, bang, going on at all hours of the night. At first, I imagined the noises were produced by some evil-disposed persons who wished, for purposes of their own, to keep the house uninhabited. But by degrees, Claire and I came to the conclusion that the visitation must be supernatural, and Martingale, by consequence, untenantable. Still, being practical people, and unlike our predecessors, not having money to live where and how we liked, we decided to watch and see whether we could trace any human influence in the matter. If not, it was agreed we were to pull down the right wing of the house and the principal staircase. For nights and nights we sat up till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, but just to test the matter, I determined on Christmas Eve, the anniversary of Mr. Jeremy Lester's disappearance, to keep watch by myself in the red bedchamber. Even to Claire I never mentioned my intention. About 10, tired out with our previous vigils, we each retired to rest. Somewhat ostentatiously, perhaps, I noisily shut the door of my room, and when I opened it half an hour afterwards, no mouse could have pursued its way along the corridor with greater silence and caution than myself. Quite in the dark, I sat in the red room. For over an hour I might as well have been in my grave for anything I could see in the apartment. But at the end of that time, the moon rose and cast strange lights across the floor and upon the wall of the haunted chamber. Hitherto I had kept my watch opposite the window. Now I changed my place to a corner near the door, where I was shaded from observation by the heavy hangings of the bed and an antique wardrobe. Still I sat on, but no sound broke the silence. I was weary with many nights watching and tired of my solitary vigil. I dropped at last into a slumber from which I was awakened by hearing the door softly open. "John," said my sister, almost in a whisper. "John, are you here?" "Yes, Claire," I answered. "But what are you doing up at this hour?" "Come downstairs," she replied. "They are in the oak parlor." I did not need any explanation as to whom she meant, but crept downstairs after her, warned by an uplifted hand of the necessity for silence and caution. By the door, by the open door of the oak parlor, she paused, and we both looked in. There was the room we left in darkness overnight, with a bright wood fire blazing on the hearth, candles on the chimney piece, the small table pulled out from its accustomed corner, and 2 men seated beside it, playing at cribbage. We could see the face of the younger player. It was that of a man about 25, of a man who had lived hard and wickedly, who had wasted his substance and his health, who had been, while in the flesh, Jeremy Lester. It would be difficult for me to say how I knew this, how in a moment I identified the features of the player with those of a man who had been missing for 41 years. 41 years that very night. He was dressed in the costume of a bygone period. His hair was powdered, and round his wrists there were ruffles of lace. He looked like one who, having come from some great party, had sat down after his return home to play at cards with an intimate friend. On his little finger there sparkled a ring. In the front of his shirt there gleamed a valuable diamond. There were diamond buckles in his shoes, and according to the fashion of his time, he wore knee breeches and silk stockings, which showed off advantageously the shape of a remarkably good leg and ankle. He sat opposite to the door, but never once lifted his eyes to it. His attention seemed concentrated on the cards. For a time there was utter silence in the room, broken only by the monotonous counting of the game. In the doorway we stood, holding our breath, terrified and yet fascinated by the scene which was being acted before us. The ashes dropped on the hearth softly and like the snow. We could hear the rustle of the cards as they were dealt out and fell upon the table. We listened to the count, 15-1, 15-2, and so forth, but there was no other word spoken till at length the player, whose face we could not see, exclaimed, "I win. The game is mine." Then his opponent took up the cards, sorted them over negligently in his hand and put them close together, and flung the whole pack in his guest's face, exclaiming, "Cheat! Liar! Take that!" There was a bustle and a confusion, a flinging over of the chairs and a fierce gesticulation, and such a noise of passionate voices mingling, that we could not hear a sentence which was uttered. All at once, however, Jeremy Lester strode out of the room in so great a hurry that he almost touched us where we stood, out of the room and tramp, tramp up the staircase to the Red Room, whence he descended in a few minutes with a couple of rapiers under his arm. When he re-entered the room, he gave, as it seemed to us, the other man his choice of weapons, and then he flung open the window, and after ceremoniously giving place to his opponent to pass out first, he walked forth into the night air, Claire and I following. We went through the garden and down a narrow winding walk to a smooth piece of turf sheltered from the north by a plantation of young fir trees. It was a bright moonlit night by this time, and we could distinctly see Jeremy Lester measuring off the ground. "When you say 3, he said to the man, whose back was still towards us. They had drawn lots for the ground, and the lot had fallen against Mr. Lester. He stood thus with the moonbeams falling full upon him. A handsomer fellow I would never desire to behold. 1, began the other. 2, and before our kinsman had the slightest suspicion of his design, he was upon him, and his rapier through Jeremy Lester's breast. At the sight of that cowardly treachery, Claire screamed aloud. In a moment the combatants had disappeared. The moon was obscured behind a cloud, and we were standing in the shadow of the fir plantation, shivering with cold and terror. But we knew at last what had become of the late owner of Martingale, that he had fallen, not in fair fight, but foully murdered by a false friend. When late on Christmas morning I awoke, it was to see a white world, to behold the ground and trees and shrubs all laden and covered with snow. There was snow everywhere, such snow as no person could remember having fallen for 41 years. It was on such a Christmas as this that Mr. Jeremy disappeared, remarked the old sexton to my sister, who had insisted on dragging me through the snow to church, whereupon Claire fainted away and was carried into the vestry, where I made a full confession to the vicar of all we had beheld the previous night. At first, that worthy individual rather inclined to treat the matter lightly, but when a fortnight after the snow melted away and the fir plantation came to be examined, he confessed there might be more things in heaven and earth than his limited philosophy had dreamed of. In a little clear space, just within the plantation, Jeremy Lester's body was found. We knew it by the ring and the diamond buckles and the sparkling breastpin. And Mr. Cronson, who, in his capacity as magistrate, came over to inspect these relics, was visibly perturbed at my narrative. "Pray, Mr. Lester, did you, in your dream, see the face of the gentleman, your kinsman's opponent?" "No," I answered. "He sat and stood with his back to us the whole time." "There is nothing more, of course, to be done in this matter," observed Mr. Cronson. "Nothing," I replied, "and there the affair would doubtless have terminated, but that a few days afterwards, when we were dining at Cronson Park, Claire all of a sudden dropped the glass of water she was carrying to her lips and exclaiming, 'Look, John, there he is!' rose from her seat and with a face as white as the tablecloth, pointed to a portrait hanging on the wall. I saw him for an instant when he turned his head towards the door as Jeremy Lester left," she exclaimed. "That is he!" Of what followed after this identification, I have only the vaguest recollection. Servants rushed hither and thither. Mr. Cronson dropped off her chair into hysterics. The young ladies gathered round their mamma. Mr. Cronson, trembling like one in an ague fit, attempted some kind of explanation, while Claire kept praying to be taken away, only to be taken away. I took her away, not merely from Cronson Park, but from Martingale. Before we left the latter place, however, I had an interview with Mr. Cronson, who said the portrait Claire had identified was that of his wife's father, the last person who saw Jeremy Lester alive. "He is an old man now," finished Mr. Cronson, "a man of over 80 who has confessed everything to me. You won't bring further sorrow and disgrace upon us by making this matter public." I promised him I would keep my silence. But the story gradually oozed out, and the Cronsons left the country. My sister never returned to Martingale. She married and is living in London, though I assure her there are no strange noises now in my house. She will not visit Bedfordshire, where the little girl she wanted me so long ago to think seriously of is now my wife and the mother of my children. As many Scary to Sleep fans know, I've been going through a lot of changes in my life, and one thing I've been doing is getting my finances much more organized, and that includes paring down some of the subscriptions I pay for. It feels like everything is a subscription these days, be it for the gym or streaming services or music, the list goes on, and something that has helped me tremendously is Rocket Money. They not only helped me cancel subscriptions that were a pain to try to do myself. Have you ever tried to deal with some of these companies directly? It's just a headache. Rocket Money also alerts me when the subscriptions I did keep go up in price, giving me the ability to weigh my options and keep those little extras that add up oh so quickly in check. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that finds and cancels your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills. I can see all of my subscriptions in one place, and if I see something I don't want, I can cancel it with a tap. I never have to get on the phone with customer service. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has helped save its members an average of $720 a year with over 500 million in canceled subscriptions. Stop wasting money on things you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/scareyoutosleep. That's rocketmoney.com/scareyoutosleep. rocketmoney.com/scareyoutosleep. This next story was published in 1931 by A.M. Barrage, and it's called Smee. No, said Jackson with a deprecatory smile. I'm sorry. I don't want to upset your game. I shan't be doing that because you'll have plenty without me. But I'm not playing any games of hide and seek. It was Christmas Eve, and we were a party of 14 with just the proper leavening of youth. We had dined well. It was the season for childish games, and we were all in the mood for playing them. All, that is, except Jackson. When somebody suggested hide and seek, there was rapturous and almost unanimous approval. He was the one dissentient voice. It was not like Jackson to spoil sport or refuse to do as others wanted. Somebody asked him if he were feeling seedy. No, he answered. I feel perfectly fit, thanks, but... he added with a smile which softened without retracting the flat refusal. I'm not playing hide and seek. Why not? Someone asked. He hesitated for a moment before replying. I sometimes go and stay at a house where a girl was killed. She was playing hide and seek in the dark. She didn't know the house very well. There was a door that led to the servants' staircase. When she was chased, she thought the door led to a bedroom. She opened the door and jumped and landed at the bottom of the stairs. She broke her neck, of course. We all looked serious. Mrs. Fernley said, How terrible! And were you there when it happened? Jackson shook his head sadly. No, he said. But I was there when something else happened. Something worse. What could have been worse than that? This was, said Jackson. He hesitated for a moment. Then he said, I wonder if any of you have ever played a game called Smee. It's much better than hide and seek. The name comes from It's Me, of course. Perhaps you'd like to play it instead of hide and seek. Let me tell you the rules of the game. Every player is given a sheet of paper. All the sheets, except one, are blank. On the last sheet of paper is written Smee. Nobody knows who Smee is except Smee himself or herself. You turn out the lights, and Smee goes quietly out of the room and hides. After a time, the others go off to search for Smee. But of course, they don't know who they're looking for. When one player meets another, he challenges him by saying, Smee. The other answers, Smee, and they continue searching. But the real Smee doesn't answer when someone challenges. The second player stands quietly beside him. Presently, they will be discovered by a third player. He will challenge and receive no answer, and he will join the first two. This goes on until all the players are in the same place. The last one to find Smee has to pay a forfeit. It's a good, noisy, amusing game. In a big house, it often takes a long time for everyone to find Smee. Perhaps you'd like to try. I'll happily pay my forfeit and sit here by the fire while you play. It sounds a good game, I remarked. Have you played it too, Jackson? Yes, he answered. I played it in the house I was telling you about. And she was there, the girl who broke... No, said someone else. He told us he wasn't there when she broke her neck. Jackson thought for a moment. I don't know if she was there or not. I'm afraid she was. I know that there were 13 of us playing the game, and there were only 12 people in the house. And I didn't know the dead girl's name. When I heard that whispered name in the dark, it did worry me, but I tell you, I'm never going to play that kind of game again. It made me quite nervous for a long time. I prefer to pay my forfeit at once. We all stared at him. His words did not make sense at all. Tim Vouse, the kindest man in the world, he smiled at us all. This sounds like an interesting story, he said. Come on, Jackson. You tell it to us instead of paying a forfeit. Very well, said Jackson. And here is his story. Have you ever met the Sangstons? They are cousins of mine, and they live in Surrey. 5 years ago, they invited me to go and spend Christmas with them. It was an old house with lots of unnecessary passages and staircases. A stranger could get lost in there quite easily. Well, I went down for that Christmas. Violet Sangston promised me that I knew most of the other guests. Unfortunately, I couldn't get away from my job until Christmas Eve. All the other guests had arrived there the previous day. I was the last to arrive, and I was only just in time for dinner. I said hello to everyone I knew, and Violet Sangston introduced me to the people I didn't know. Then it was time to go to dinner. This is perhaps why I didn't hear the name of a tall, dark-haired, handsome girl whom I hadn't met before. Everyone was in rather a hurry, and I am always bad at catching people's names. She looked cold and clever. She didn't look at all friendly, but she looked interesting, and I wondered who she was. I didn't ask because I was sure that someone would speak out her name during the meal. Unluckily, however, I was a long way from her at the table. I was sitting next to Mrs. Gorman, and as usual, Mrs. Gorman was being very bright and amusing. Her conversation is always worth listening to, and I completely forgot to ask the name of the dark, proud girl. There were 12 of us, including the Sangstons themselves, who were all young, or trying to be young. Jack and Violet Sangston were the oldest, and their 17-year-old son Reggie was the youngest. It was Reggie who suggested Smee when the talk turned to games. He told us the rules of the game, just as I've described to you. Jack Sangston warned us all. If you are going to play games in the dark, he said, please be careful of the back stairs on the first floor. A door leads to them, and I've often thought about taking that door off. In the dark, a stranger in the house could think that they were walking into a room. A girl really did break her neck on those stairs. I asked how it happened. It was 10 years ago, before we came here. There was a party, and they were playing hide and seek. The girl was looking for somewhere to hide. She heard somebody coming and ran along the passage to get away. She opened the door, thinking it led to a bedroom. She planned to hide in there until the seeker had gone. Unfortunately, it was the door that led to the back stairs. She fell straight down to the bottom of the stairs. She was dead when they picked her up. We all promised to be careful. Mrs. Gorman even made a little joke about living to be 90. You see, none of us had known the poor girl, and we did not want to feel sad on Christmas Eve. Well, we all started the game immediately after dinner. Young Reggie Sangston went around making sure all the lights were off except the ones in the servants' rooms and in the sitting room where we were. We then prepared 12 sheets of paper. 11 of them were blank, and one of them had Smee written on it. Reggie mixed them all up, and we each took one. The person who got the paper with Smee on it had to hide. I looked at mine and saw it was blank. A moment later, all the electric lights were out. In the darkness, I heard someone moving very quietly to the door. After a minute, somebody blew a whistle, and we all rushed to the door. I had no idea who was Smee. For 5 or 10 minutes, we were all rushing up and down passages and in and out of rooms, challenging each other and answering, "Smee? Smee?" After a while, the noise died down, and I guessed that someone had found Smee. And after a time, I found a group of people all sitting on some narrow stairs. I challenged and received no answer, so Smee was there. I hurriedly joined the group. Presently, 2 more players arrived. Each one was hurrying to avoid being last. Jack Sangston was last and was given a forfeit. "I think we're all here now, aren't we?" he remarked. He lit a match, looked up the staircase, and began to count. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, he said, and then laughed. "That's silly. There's one too many." The match went out, and he lit another and began to count. He got as far as 12, and he looked puzzled. "There are 13 people here," he said. "I haven't counted myself yet." "Oh, nonsense," I laughed. "You probably began with yourself, and now you want to count yourself twice." His son took out his electric torch. It gave a better light than the matches, and we all began to count. Of course, there were 12 of us. Jack laughed. "Well," he said, "I was sure I counted 13 twice." From halfway up the stairs, Violet Sangston spoke nervously. "I thought there was somebody sitting 2 steps above me. Have you moved, Captain Ransom?" The captain said he hadn't, but I thought that there was someone sitting between Mrs. Sangston and me. Just for a moment, there was an uncomfortable something in the air. A cold finger seemed to touch us all. For a moment, we all felt that something odd and unpleasant had just happened, and was likely to happen again. Then we laughed at ourselves and at each other, and we felt normal again. There were only 12 of us, and that was that. Still laughing, we marched back to the sitting room to begin again. This time, I was Smee. Violet Sangston found me while I was searching for a hiding place. That game didn't last long. Soon there were 12 people and the game was over. Violet felt cold and wanted her jacket. Her husband went up to the bedroom to fetch it. As soon as he'd gone, Reggie touched me on the arm. He was looking pale and sick. "Quick," he whispered. "I've got to talk to you. Something horrible has happened." We went into the breakfast room. "What's the matter?" I asked. "I don't know. You were Smee last time, weren't you?" Well, of course, I didn't know who Smee was. While Mother and the others ran to the west side of the house and found you, I went east. There's a deep clothes cupboard in my bedroom. It looked like a good hiding place. I thought perhaps Smee might be there. I opened the door in the dark and touched somebody's hand. Smee, I whispered. There was no answer. I thought I'd found Smee. Well, I don't understand it, but I suddenly had a strange, cold feeling. I can't describe it, but I felt that something was wrong. So I turned on my electric torch, and there was nobody there. Now I am sure I touched a hand, and nobody could get out of the cupboard because I was standing in the doorway. What do you think? You imagined that you touched a hand, I said. He gave a short laugh. I knew you would say that, he said. Of course I imagined it. That's the only explanation, isn't it? I agreed with him. I could see that he still felt shaken. Together we returned to the sitting room for another game of Smee. The others were all ready and waiting to start again. Perhaps it was my imagination, although I'm almost sure that it was not. But I had a feeling that nobody was really enjoying the game anymore, but everyone was too polite to mention it. All the same, I had the feeling that something was wrong. All the fun had gone out of the game. Something deep inside me was trying to warn me. Take care, it whispered. Take care. There was some unnatural, unhealthy influence at work in the house. Why did I have this feeling? Because Jack Sangston had counted 13 people instead of 12? Because his son imagined that he had touched someone's hand in an empty cupboard? I tried to laugh at myself, but I did not succeed. Well, we started again. While we were all chasing the unknown Smee, we were all as noisy as ever. But it seemed to me that most of us were just acting. We were no longer enjoying the game. At first I stayed with the others, but for several minutes no Smee was found. I left the main group and started searching on the first floor at the west side of the house. And there, while I was feeling my way along, I bumped into a pair of human knees. I put out my hand and touched a soft, heavy curtain. Then I knew where I was. There were tall, deep windows with window seats at the end of the passage. The curtains reached to the ground. Somebody was sitting in a corner of one of these window seats, behind a curtain. Aha, I thought, I've caught Smee. So I pulled the curtain to one side and touched a woman's arm. It was a dark, moonless night outside. I couldn't see the woman sitting in the corner of the window seat. Smee? I whispered. There was no answer. When Smee is challenged, he or she does not answer. So I sat down beside her to wait for the others. Then I whispered, "What's your name?" And out of the darkness beside me, the whisper came, "Brenda Ford." I did not know the name, but I guessed at once who she was. I knew every girl in the house by name except one, and that was the tall, pale, dark girl. So here, she was sitting beside me on the window seat, shut in between a heavy curtain and a window. I was enjoying the game. I wondered if she was enjoying it too. I whispered one or two rather ordinary questions to her and received no answer. Smee is a game of silence. It is a rule of the game that Smee and the person or persons who have found Smee have to keep quiet. This, of course, makes it harder for the others to find them. But there was nobody else about. I wondered, therefore, why she was insisting on silence. I spoke again and got no answer. I began to feel a little annoyed. Perhaps she is one of those cold, clever girls who have a poor opinion of all men, I thought. She doesn't like me, and she is using the rules of the game as an excuse for not speaking. Well, if she doesn't like sitting here with me, I certainly don't want to sit with her. I turned away from her. I hope someone finds us soon, I thought. As I sat there, I realized that I disliked sitting beside this girl very much indeed. That was strange. The girl I had seen at dinner had seemed likable in a cold kind of way. I noticed her and wanted to know more about her. But now I felt really uncomfortable beside her. The feeling of something wrong, something unnatural, was growing. I remembered touching her arm, and I trembled with horror. I wanted to jump up and run away. I prayed that someone else would come along soon. Just then, I heard light footsteps in the passage. Somebody on the other side of the curtain brushed against my knees. The curtain moved to one side, and a woman's hand touched my shoulder. "Smee," whispered a voice that I recognized at once. It was Mrs. Gorman. Of course, she received no answer. She came and sat down beside me, and at once I felt very much better. "It's Toni Jackson, isn't it?" she whispered. "Yes," I whispered back. "You're not Smee, are you?" "No, she's on my other side." She reached out across me. I heard her fingernails scratch a woman's silk dress. "Hello, Smee. How are you? Who are you? Oh, is it against the rules to talk? Never mind. Toni, we'll break the rules. Do you know, Toni, this game is beginning to annoy me a little. I hope they aren't going to play it all evening. I'd like to play a nice quiet game all together beside a warm fire." "Me too," I agreed. "Can't you suggest something to them? There's something rather unhealthy about this particular game. I'm sure I'm being very silly, but I can't get rid of the idea that we've got an extra player. Somebody who ought not be here at all." That was exactly how I felt, but I didn't say so. However, I felt very much better. Mrs. Gorman's arrival had chased away my fears. We sat talking. "I wonder when the others will find us," said Mrs. Gorman. After a time, we heard the sound of feet and young Reggie's voice shouting, "Hello? Hello? Is anybody there?" "Yes," I answered. "Is Mrs. Gorman with you?" "Yes." "What happened to you? You've both got forfeits. We've all been waiting for hours." "But you haven't found Smee yet," I complained. "You haven't, you mean. I was Smee this time." "But Smee is here with us," I cried. "Yes," agreed Mrs. Gorman. The curtain was pulled back, and we sat looking into the eye of Reggie's electric torch. I looked at Mrs. Gorman, and then on my other side. Between me and the wall was an empty place on the window seat. I stood up at once. Then I sat down again. I was feeling very sick, and the world seemed to be going round and round. "There was somebody there," I insisted, "because I touched her." "So did I," said Mrs. Gorman in a trembling voice. "And I don't think anyone could leave this window seat without us knowing." Reggie gave a shaky little laugh. I remembered his unpleasant experience earlier that evening. "Someone's playing jokes," he said. "Are you coming down?" We were not very popular when we came down to the sitting room. "I found the two of them sitting behind a curtain on a window seat," said Reggie. I went up to the tall, dark girl. "So you pretended to be Smee and then went away," I accused her. She shook her head. Afterwards, we all played cards in the sitting room, and I was very glad. Sometime later, Jack Sangston wanted to talk to me. I could tell that he was rather cross with me, and soon he told me the reason. "Tony," he said, "I suppose you are in love with Mrs. Gorman. That's your business, but please don't make love to her in my house during a game. You kept everyone waiting. It was very rude of you, and I'm ashamed of you." "But we were not alone," I protested. "There was somebody else there. Somebody who was pretending to be Smee. I believe it was that tall, dark girl, Miss Ford. She whispered her name to me. Of course, she refused to admit it afterwards." Jack Sangston stared at me. "Miss who?" he breathed. "Brenda Ford. She said." Jack put a hand on my shoulder. "Look here, Tony," he said. "I don't mind a joke, but enough is enough. We don't want to worry the ladies. Brenda Ford is the name of the girl who broke her neck on the stairs. She was playing hide and seek here 10 years ago. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my little Christmas special. Read some ghost stories this weekend with your friends and family. Act them out. Dress up. Scare the shit out of someone by wearing a dark hooded robe and waking them up at 3 a.m. saying you're the ghost of Christmas future. Now, I know I wouldn't be having as merry of a Christmas without this week's Patreon subscribers. Thank you so much to Christopher Kohler, Matthew Staton, Julie Marzinski, and Christina Tobar. You have my eternal gratitude. Thank you for your support. If you'd like some bonus episodes and guided nightmares, just head over to patreon.com/scarytosleep. And for as little as $1, you can gain access to all those extras. Follow me on social media, Twitter and Instagram @scarytosleep. My personal Instagram is Shelby B. Scott. Join the Facebook group to interact with some of the authors I feature and with me. Facebook.com/scarytosleep. Please answer the security question so we know you aren't a sex bot that runs on Bitcoin trying to sell us Herbalife. Christmas Day, I have a fun surprise for you guys. So if you're stuck working or not able to see your loved ones, check my feed and I'll have a little something for you to pass the time. Thank you, Rosemary, for posting the picture of your Scary to Sleep mug on the Facebook group. Feel free to post your own Scary to Sleep merch in the group or tag me so I can put you on the Instagram page. I think that's all for now. Merry Christmas, and whatever and however you celebrate, I hope you have a great time doing it. Now, go get some sleep. Sweet dreams.